Good afternoon. My name is Eric Kaplan, and I'm a historian of psychiatry. And this afternoon, I'm going to tell you about a very famous case, Osheroff v. Chestnut Lodge. And the case involves a physician, Dr. Raphael Osheroff, who sued a famous private psychiatric hospital, Chestnut Lodge, in 1982 for refusing to provide him antidepressant medication to treat his manic depressive disorder. And as a result of that denial, Dr. Osheroff contended that he was denied the standard of care that had been commonplace in the United States by the 1970s. I love this passage from Macbeth, but I always have taken issue with two words, the word idiot and the word nothing. But in many respects, I think this passage brilliantly captures the life of Dr. Raphael Osheroff. About that, we can talk a little more this afternoon if you'd like when I get through. While there's certainly notable exceptions, which I'll get to in a minute, virtually every scholar and historian who's written about the Osheroff case begins and ends their research by focusing on just two articles, the ones that I featured here on this slide. These articles appeared in the April 1990 issue of the American Journal of Psychiatry, and they feature pieces by two of the most prominent psychiatrists in the United States at the time, Professors Gerald Clearman and Alan Stone. In each of these pieces, the two luminaries, as it were, square off over what they take to be the principal significance of the Osheroff case. And it's largely based on their respective tellings that the entire discourse regarding the meaning, significance, and import of the Osheroff case is understood for, again, as I said, almost 3 decades. And what's interesting is that very few historians look beyond these two pieces to understand what the case may really have been about. As a parenthetical aside, 1990 was more than a full decade after Dr. Raphael Osheroff was discharged from Silver Hill Foundation in November of 1979. It was also 7 years after the 1983 Maryland healthcare arbitration hearing, which is what everyone really talks about when they talk about the case. The image on the left is my favorite document that I was ever able to acquire in the course of my research. It recounts the notes from the very first meeting between Dr. Osheroff and Philip J. Hirschkopf, the attorney who represented him, and developed the strategy that enabled Dr. Osheroff to prevail in his case against Chestnut Lodge. That meeting took place just 6 days after Dr. Osheroff had been discharged from Silver Hill Foundation in New Canaan, Connecticut. And if you look at the notes, what's really fascinating is it tells you almost everything you need to know about the ensuing case. First, it lists Dr. Robert Greenspan, who was a colleague of Dr. Osheroff's, whom, based on Phil Hirschkopf's advice, they later went after and secured $1 million verdict, which was then used to finance his lawsuit against Chestnut Lodge. And when you look at Chestnut Lodge, you see the list of all of the defendants, Manny Ross, Wesley Dingman, and you also see the name of the ward where Dr. Osheroff had been held. With the exception of Peter Kramer, all the authors below rely almost exclusively on the 1990 Clearman-Stone AJP debate to tell the story about Osheroff v. Chestnut Lodge. Some supplement their research by interviewing Alan Stone, even though Stone played no role of the case. He never examined Dr. Osheroff, and he never met with him until 1989, some 10 years after he'd been released from the Silver Hill Foundation. In pointing this out, I certainly don't mean to fault these authors for failing to identify other sources, because of course, the Osheroff case plays only a tiny part in their larger narratives. That said, here are just 4 examples of what I'm talking about, and I could easily offer another dozen, if not more. What I show here is that if you actually look in the notes of many of these books, again, you only find these same two sources. Once in a blue moon, some of the later works, in addition to those two sources, you'll see citations of the prior books, which indeed cite the identical same two sources. Now, while relying on the same two sources to tell a small part of a larger narrative is hardly something to frown upon, I do think what's egregious is that virtually every author who's written about the case actually misspells Dr. Osheroff's first name. Now, I admit, I was baffled by the repeated misspelling of Dr. Osheroff's first name for months until I discovered the likely source of this error. In his 1990 American Journal of Psychiatry debate with Alan Stone, which I mentioned just a moment ago, Jerry Klerbin misspells Dr. Osheroff's first name, an error that's been repeated at least 20 times, according to my admittedly unscientific count. Now, there are two notable exceptions, which ironically are the first and the most recent books to consider the case. Those are James Kelly's 1996 book and Rachel Aviv's 2022 book. What's surprising is, as far as I can tell, virtually no one has ever cited Kelly's book, which includes an excellent fact-based discussion of the Osheroff case based on a wealth of contemporary sources. And it's not an obscure book. It's published by a major university press and has received excellent reviews. And yet, for more than 20 years, no one has ever bothered to take a look. What's even more odd is that in the quarter-plus century between Kelly's and Aviv's work, not one single account of the case acknowledges the voice of Dr. Osheroff, and none cites the letter he published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in response to the Stone-Klerbin debate, in which, as the example makes clear, he spells his own name correctly. This letter was easy to find. It's not like it was buried in some file, in some box, in some archive. Indeed, it was one of the first documents that I uncovered when I started looking into the case. What's not odd but difficult to explain is why Alan Stone chose to comment on the Osheroff case in a November 22, 1984 New England Journal of Medicine piece, which is the first publication about the affair, and sadly, it defines the parameters for all subsequent discussions of the case, despite Professor Stone's myriad misrepresentation of the facts at the center of the dispute. I'd like to point out three things from the piece that sort of stuck out to me. The first is Stone's use of the passive voice when describing how he secured these materials, which of course begs the question about who provided him the materials in the first place, and I'll get to that in a second. The second is Stone's claim that the patient's expert psychiatric witnesses had diagnosed him as having an obvious case of biological depression. And while the statement's not false, it's egregiously misleading in light of a number of other facts, which I'll also explain. And then finally, and perhaps most egregiously, Stone claims that, quote, the private psychiatric hospital, unquote, contended that the patient was properly diagnosed as having a narcissistic personality disorder. This statement is pure fabrication. What's more, the term narcissistic personality disorder does not even appear in the DSM-2, which was still in use in 1979 when Dr. Osheroff first arrived at Chestnut Lodge on January 2nd of that year, and it was the DSM-2 which provided the actual source of the diagnosis that Dr. Osheroff actually received upon admission. Now, there's little doubt that Alan Stone knew what he wrote did not reflect the record, because he had the record. On March 23, 1984, 9 months prior to his publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, Stone wrote to Dr. Osheroff, asking several questions about the case. In response, Dr. Osheroff provided Stone with, among other items, his complete medical records from the lodge, including the diagnosis the private psychiatric hospital made when he was first admitted. As you can see, there's no mention of any narcissistic personality disorder, and also, as you can see, the primary diagnosis that the lodge psychiatrist gave to Dr. Osheroff was manic depressive illness, depressed type. Responding to Alan Stone's false claims that appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine piece, John Grad, one of Dr. Osheroff's attorneys, submitted a letter to the New England Journal rebutting Stone's, quote, fracturing of the facts. But the New England Journal of Medicine rejected Grad's letter and instead forwarded it to Dr. Alan Stone, who responded in private to John Grad. On this slide, you can see the exchange between both Alan Stone and John Grad that took place between February and early March of 1985. The two men have a very cordial interaction, but in the end, Stone concludes by telling Grad, and you can read it with your own eyes, "I agree with everything you say." But what Stone said in private, it turns out, he was unwilling to say in public for the rest of his life. With the New England Journal of Medicine refusing to publish Grad's rebuttal to Stone's article, Dr. Gerald Clearman decides to draft an article in response to the Stone piece that he himself hopes to publish in the New England Journal. But not wanting to harm Osheroff's legal argument as the case is working its way through the appeals process, Clearman works closely with Osheroff's legal team to ensure he gets his facts straight in this piece. Now, as part of this process, John Grad explains the origins of the narcissistic personality disorder diagnosis, which he correctly notes, based on the timeline, quote, is a product not of some contemporaneous diagnostic process that happened at the lodge, but rather of the rigors of malpractice litigation. And he reminds Clearman that even the lodge's own expert psychiatric witness, their own hired gun, if you will, Dr. Michael Spodak, stated in a sworn deposition and then later in his testimony during the 1983 Maryland healthcare arbitration hearing that Dr. Osheroff did not have a narcissistic personality disorder. Now, while he acknowledged that Dr. Osheroff had some narcissistic traits, he further said, well, so does everybody. 15 months later, Alan Stone once again expresses his fears to a reporter that the Osheroff case may, quote, have an incredible impact on all those doctors who want to approach those patients whose diagnosis is debatable with psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy. In reply to Stone's expressed concerns, Jonathan Mook, another member of Dr. Osheroff's legal team, responds by directing attention to the specific facts of the Osheroff case and the type of psychotherapy he received while at Chestnut Lodge. Now, I've spent a great deal of time with Jonathan and conducted a lengthy recorded oral interview with him, as I have several other participants in the case. Jonathan's an incredibly gentle soul. He was salutatorian at his class at Yale Law School, but forsook the riches of private practice to do civil rights law. He knew Ray well, and the portion of his letter that I've highlighted, I believe, is the single best encapsulation that I've ever come across to describe the case, in which he writes, even if a minority of physicians might support the use of psychotherapy for the treatment of depression, I doubt a respectable minority would support the type of therapy inflicted on Dr. Osheroff. Now, I've shared this backstory to reinforce how odd, albeit hardly surprising, it is that so many historians and scholars have uncritically accepted the Clearman-Stone accounts of the case, especially Stone's, given that these two prominent, powerful pillars of the psychiatric establishment were hardly dispassionate observers and had agendas having little to do with the case. Though a distinction needs to be made, Clearman was a participant in the case. He also cared deeply about Dr. Osheroff as a person, and I've read a number of exchanges between the two men that really reinforce this. Stone didn't care at all about Dr. Osheroff, and he actually had never met the man. But more significantly, there are also a number of other participants in the case, virtually all of whom know as much, if not more, about the case than Jerry Clearman, and certainly mountains more about the case than Alan Stone, who played no role in the litigation and made no effort to get to know or understand the plaintiff, Ray Osheroff. A few months back, I came across this statement from Dr. Bernard Carroll, who, like Jerry Clearman, was also an expert witness during the Osheroff case. Carroll was not one to suffer fools. Indeed, he spent the latter part of his career as a critic of his own profession, and as he later explained, excuse me, I was one of the experts in the case of Osheroff v. Chestnut Lodge. The public debate between Gerald Clearman and Alan Stone that followed the Osheroff hearing was a tiresome, ego-fueled distraction from the essential issue in the case. The Osheroff case was not about the efficacy and regulation of psychotherapy. The Osheroff case was a straightforward medical malpractice case involving negligent assessment and diagnosis, which led to obstinately misguided treatment. I should know. I testified at the Maryland Health Claims Arbitration hearing of Dr. Osheroff's complaint in November of 1983, and I reviewed the entire record. The sheer incompetence of the Chestnut Lodge psychiatrists and of their clinical care system was breathtaking. Dr. William Potter, who served as an expert witness in the Osheroff case, had previously conducted an extensive psychiatric evaluation of Dr. Osheroff soon after his discharge from Silver Hill Foundation in New Canaan, Connecticut. He did his evaluation in early 1980, and the purpose of the evaluation was part of a process to determine if Dr. Osheroff's medical privileges should be restored, to confirm that he was in good health, both physically and psychiatrically, to be able to resume his ability to treat patients effectively as a nephrologist. Now, Bill and I have spent hours discussing the case, and Bill offers a radically different interpretation than does Alan Stone, who, at least by my understanding, appears to have discarded many inconvenient facts. And I thought it might be worth reading exactly what Bill had to say in a letter he wrote in December of 1982 about his experience based on his psychiatric evaluation of Dr. Osheroff. In January of 1980, I carried out a detailed psychiatric evaluation of Dr. Raphael J. Osheroff at the request of the Virginia Board of Hospitals at Alexandria, Virginia. My conclusion was that Dr. Osheroff had suffered from a psychotic agitated depression, which was unresponsive to psychotherapy, but did respond to psychopharmacologic treatment, which he received at Silver Hill Foundation of New Haven, Connecticut, between August 1st and November 1st of 1979. I further concluded that the deterioration that Dr. Osheroff experienced between 1978 across the summer of 1979 appeared to be a product of inadequate treatment and would not be expected to recur again were he to experience another period of depression. In other words, what Potter is saying without saying is that what exacerbated in a significant and profound way Dr. Osheroff's depression was the mismanagement and mistreatment he received at Chestnut Lodge. The reason why I think it's so important to cite other participants who were in the room where it happened is because their tellings are remarkably different than what we encounter when we consider only the work of Alan Stone or Jerry Clearman, but most especially Alan Stone, who, as I said before, was never part of the litigation. So let me focus on just two examples where I think Alan Stone has led people astray. The first is Gail Hornstein, who, to her credit, spells Dr. Osheroff's first name correctly. She relies on Alan Stone's account of the case in her magisterial biography of Freda Fromm-Reichmann, and she's thus led astray by Stone's telling, as is evident in this passage that I quote below from her text. Because as I should explain, every medical malpractice case is to some extent about violating the standard of care. Were that not at issue, a judge would throw the case out before it ever moved an inch. So when Professor Hornstein writes, Osheroff didn't make that claim, That's simply incorrect. And then when she adds, quote, nor did he charge ordinary malpractice, that a physician had failed to administer treatment for an identifiable illness or had delivered that treatment in a competent way, but Osheroff made a different argument, that it was the lodge's choice of treatment, intensive psychotherapy, that had been at fault. That's just completely untrue. The precise claim that Dr. Osheroff made in his pleading was that because he had been diagnosed with manic depressive disorder, he was denied the standard of care, which circa 1979 involved a combination of either medication or electroshock or a combination of both. Nowhere in the existing medical literature across the entire 1970s could you find any respectable physician, minority or otherwise, who would suggest that you could treat a case of manic depressive disorder by psychotherapy alone. And now to my second example, Rachel Aviv's widely heralded new book, Strangers to Ourself. Now, I should add that I really, really admire Rachel's work, and I've written a laudatory review of her book that will appear later this year in History of Psychiatry. But Rachel also cites Alan Stone as one of her sources on the Lodge, despite his never having been there and his not having played any formal role in the legal dispute. And while this may just be my impression, what I took away from reading Rachel's book, among other things, was that she uncritically accepts the Lodge's propaganda of itself, and that she doesn't really question those who speak of what a wonderful place it was. A point I made at the beginning of my talk is that conspicuously absent from so much of the treatment of Osheroff v. Chestnut Lodge is any effort to hear the voice of the patient himself, of Dr. Raphael Osheroff, who certainly had a great deal to say about the case. And the point I want to emphasize is that really what was at stake in the case was not, as Stone and others suggested, a battle pitting psychopharmacology on the one hand against psychoanalysis on the other. But as Dr. Osheroff himself later explained, the question of, quote, the validity of doing psychotherapy on somebody with the necessity of keeping him in an institution for years and years and years, where they must endure the absolute horror of institutionalization. It's important to realize that Dr. Osheroff was not even remotely anti-psychoanalysis. He'd been in psychoanalysis for years before he entered Chestnut Lodge, and as soon as he left Chestnut Lodge, he resumed psychoanalytic treatment and continued to be in psychoanalytic treatment for the rest of his life. So, as far as Dr. Osheroff was concerned, I think we should take him at his own word where he says, quote, it is only the people at Chestnut Lodge who have remained insular, isolated, and incompetent. Freud, the scientist, Freud, the neurologist, Freud, the physician, had anticipated the day when psychoanalysts and endocrinologists would collaborate in unraveling the mysteries of the human mind. And then Dr. Osheroff added, when psychoanalytic clinical observations will be correlated with the exploding database of the neuroscientific revolution. When Dr. Osheroff says years and years and years, he's not exaggerating for effect. He's making a factual statement based on his own medical records that his legal team later acquired as part of the discovery process. The document below is from the initial staff conference to discuss Dr. Osheroff's case, which took place on March 12, 1979 at Chestnut Lodge. And as you can see in the item I highlighted in yellow below, the possibility of Dr. Osheroff staying at Chestnut Lodge between 5 and 10 years is openly discussed. The more and more I've thought about this case, I couldn't help but imagine the following scenario. What if Freud himself had visited Chestnut Lodge in 1979? As I thought more about the case, and more particularly about Chestnut Lodge, I couldn't help but imagine what Freud would have thought of the lodge, and how the psychiatrist at the lodge might have responded if Freud had suddenly appeared in a manner akin to Dostoevsky's tale of the Grand Inquisitor, which recounts the story of Christ's reappearance in Seville during the height of the Spanish Inquisition. As I thought more about this, I was reminded of a passage I must have read more than 20, maybe even 30 years ago from Freud's famous essay on transference, which I immediately pulled the book off my shelf and pulled out and reread. And I'm going to read it to you here right now. Supposing now it were possible, by chemical means, perhaps to interfere in this mechanism, to increase or decrease the quantity of libido present at any given time, or to strengthen one instinct at the cost of another. This then would be a causal therapy in the true sense of the word, for which our analysis would have carried out the indispensable work of reconnaissance. At present, as you know, there's no question of any such method of influencing libidinal process. With our psychical therapy, we attack at a different point in the combination, not exactly at where we know are the roots of the phenomena, but nevertheless far enough from the roots of the symptoms, at which point has brought accessible to us by roots of some very remarkable circumstances another phenomena, and this, of course, is the idea of transference. If you'd like to know more about the origins of the Clearman-Stone debate regarding the significance of the Osheroff case, I encourage you to visit my website, in particular the page at which I've listed below, item 19. And if you go there, you'll be able to find about 60 pages and multiple sources, primary sources from the very time that explored this issue. Now, just to switch gears a little bit and direct you to the second part of my presentation, I wanted to let you know that after reading everything that had been published about the case, and obviously you can see my prior slides to get a flavor and feel for just some of the material that I've been over, I convinced myself there had to be more to this story. And I was soon overwhelmed by what I had found. And during the stage, I also learned of Rachel Aviv's project, and I began a correspondence with her. And what I'm showing you on this slide is literally the sources of more than 10,000 documents that I now possess and that I've scanned. And on the right is a flash drive that somebody was kind enough to send me, one of Ray Osheroff's attorneys, David Fadula, that contains 87 gigabytes, comprising the entire 120 hours of the Maryland healthcare arbitration hearing that took place in December of 1983. Because I had so much material that was really in raw form, I'm talking about materials that an archivist, him or herself, would have to spend hundreds of hours curating. I had to devote considerable time, first to scanning and organizing more than 10,000 pages worth of documents, and also more than 120 hours of uncatalogued video footage. There were no names, no dates, no clues, completely unorganized. And then I wanted to make sure that everything was electronically searchable. And just doing this work probably took me a minimum of a couple of 100 hours. And, well, my forthcoming book, which of course is going to be the ultimate product of all this research, which I've titled Do No Harm, Osheroff v. Chestnut Lodge and the Future of Psychiatry, remains a work in progress. What became overwhelmingly apparent to me was that written words by themselves would be insufficient, woefully insufficient, to sort of convey what was in these extraordinary sources that I had discovered and acquired. So I decided to make a website, and what I thought I'd show you was a very, very preliminary outline, and I checked. I wrote this on March 30th of this past year. And to be perfectly honest, I had no idea how to make a website. I'd never made a website before. But I thought it might be a really effective means to convey some very, very fascinating material. So I immediately started talking to friends, and it took me a couple of weeks, but I soon enlisted the support of one of the top designers in the Washington, D.C. area, a brilliant young woman named Erin Lang, who's an award-winning designer. And so when she and I first spoke and I explained my project to her on the phone, she was incredibly receptive. And for the past 8+ months now, Erin and I have worked hand in glove to build this site where I am sort of the content king and Erin is the design genius. And I completely stay out of her lane, and she and I have spent on the website alone, I would say conservatively between the two of us, about 500 hours. Now, before we get to the website itself, and I show you some of the materials that I think may fascinate you, I have to end with one of my favorite quotations from Walt Whitman. It's sort of my way of saying, if you're going to criticize me, I recognize already that there will inevitably be times during which I contradict myself. I welcome your criticism. Now, before moving on, I want to play you a recording that, for obvious reasons, it's anonymous, but I think it really does set the stage for what I'm about to share with you next, which focuses exclusively on Dr. Osheroff's experience at Chestnut Lodge. So now I would like to flip the switch to cross time and space to take you to the room where it happened, to Rockville, Maryland, and to December of 1983. So let's start with Dr. Osheroff. Listening to him and what he has to say, his own words about why he decided to sue Chestnut Lodge for medical malpractice for denying him the standard of care to which he and every other patient he believed was entitled. Thank you.